The champagne glass made a sound I still hear sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I let myself remember. Not a shatter. Not a crash. Just a soft, deliberate clink against the marble side table. The kind of sound a man makes when he wants a room to notice him without raising his voice. I was 54 years old, standing in my brother-in-law's garden in Didsbury, holding a glass of Prosecco I hadn't touched, wearing a green dress I'd bought for £11 at a charity shop because I told myself it didn't matter what I wore to my nephew's graduation party. Around me, 40-some relatives, string lights strung between the oak trees, the smell of grilled lamb and cut grass, and my sister Claire, 3 glasses of wine deep, pointing a finger at me like I was a stain on her tablecloth. "Still no job, Maggie," she said, loud enough that conversations around us folded into silence one by one. "Still living off your son's paycheck. God, when's the last time you actually earned something?" She laughed, that performative laugh she does for an audience, and looked around at the guests like she was waiting for applause. "Jobless loser. That's what you are. Let's just say it." I didn't say anything. I want you to understand that. I did not defend myself. 8 months of silence had taught me that defending yourself to Claire was like arguing with weather. Pointless, exhausting, and it never changed what came next. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew standing in that garden with the ice cubes melting in our glasses, was that in 14 days, I would be sitting in a boardroom on the 9th floor of a glass building in Spinningfields, signing a contract that would make my sister's mortgage payment look like pocket change. But that was still 2 weeks away. Right now, all I had was silence, and a man 3 seats down who hadn't touched his food in the last 10 minutes. Watching everything. My name is Margaret Ellison. Most people call me Maggie except my mother, who still calls me Margaret when she's disappointed in me, which, until recently, was most of the time. I spent 26 years as a software architect. Not a coder who got promoted into a fancy title. An actual systems architect, the person companies bring in when their entire infrastructure is one server crash away from collapse. I built supply chain platforms for 2 logistics firms in Leeds, then spent 9 years at a fintech company in Manchester before it was quietly absorbed into a larger firm and my department was restructured. Corporate language for erased. I was 52 when that happened. Old enough that recruiters stopped calling back within a week. Young enough that I still had 15 working years left in me and no intention of spending them doing nothing. I remember the exact morning I got the call. A Tuesday, 9:14 a.m., HR's voice flat and rehearsed, telling me my role was being consolidated. I sat in my car in the office car park for 40 minutes afterward, not crying, just doing arithmetic in my head. Mortgage. £780 a month. Savings. 11 months' worth if I was careful. I decided right there in that car park that I was not going to spend the next year explaining myself to anyone. So I didn't tell anyone what I actually did next. I started freelancing. Architecture consulting, systems audits, the occasional contract rebuild for companies too small to have a CTO of their own. I worked from my kitchen table, usually starting before 6 in the morning because that's when my head was clearest. I kept my rates modest at first, £45 an hour, well below market, because I needed the portfolio more than I needed the money. I told my family I was between things, because the truth that I was quietly rebuilding my career from scratch, one unglamorous contract at a time, sounded less interesting to them than a story about their unemployed sister living off her son. Strange the things you choose to hide. I wasn't ashamed of freelancing. I was ashamed of how my family would react to it. The follow-up questions, the doubt disguised as concern, the inevitable comparison to Claire's husband and his 3 dealerships. Silence was easier. Silence usually is, until it isn't. My son Ryan is 26. He works as an operations lead at a logistics startup called Vero, based in Manchester. About 40 employees, growing fast, funded by a series around 18 months ago that brought in £2.1 million. Ryan has always been sharp, but he's also humble in a way that sometimes worries me, because humility in a family like mine gets mistaken for weakness. He never once told his colleagues that his mother used to run systems architecture for companies with hundreds of employees. He didn't think it was relevant. He just thought of me as here's the part that matters. 11 months ago, Ryan called me at 11:40 p.m. His voice cracking with panic. Vero's warehouse management system had failed catastrophically during a peak fulfillment period. A corrupted database migration, cascading failures across 3 regional depots, order backlogs stacking up by the hour. A client contract worth £340,000 annually was hanging by a thread because shipments weren't going out, and the client's own operations director had already sent one email with the words, "breach of service agreement" in it. He didn't ask me for help as his mother. He asked me as an architect because he knew, even if no one else in the company did, exactly what I used to do for a living, and he was desperate enough to stop caring how it looked. I told him I'd look at it. I spent the next 3 nights from midnight until sunrise, rebuilding the entire warehouse orchestration layer from a laptop at my kitchen table, remapping the depot sync logic, rewriting the failed migration scripts, rebuilding indexes that should never have been dropped in the first place. Unpaid. Uncredited. Ryan relayed my instructions to his CTO, a man named Daniel Cho, over Slack messages time-stamped at 2 and 3 in the morning, and Daniel assumed, reasonably, that Ryan himself had figured it out. We saved the client. The contract renewed for another 18 months. Nobody at Vero knew my name. I did that because he's my son. I never once thought about what it might be worth, or who might eventually find out, or what it would mean months later when a man I'd never met sat 3 seats away from me at a garden party, quietly doing arithmetic of his own. I did it because at midnight, when your child calls you in a panic, you simply answer. I never expected it to matter to anyone else. I certainly never expected it to end up mattering in front of 40 relatives in a garden in Didsbury, on a warm evening in June, over a glass of Prosecco I never touched, to understand why Claire felt entitled to humiliate me in front of a room full of people. You have to understand the architecture of my family. Because families have architecture too, load-bearing walls of favoritism that hold the whole structure up, whether anyone admits it or not. You don't see these walls when you're young. You only see them years later, standing in a garden, wondering why the ground under your feet feels like it was never quite level to begin with. Claire is 2 years younger than me and has spent our entire adult lives positioning herself as the responsible one. She married young at 23, to a man named Gary who owns 3 car dealerships across Cheshire, one in Altrincham, one in Wilmslow, one just off the A34 near Alderley Edge. From the day of her wedding, a wedding that cost more than my entire first year's salary as a junior developer, she treated financial comfort as a personality trait rather than a circumstance. As if the money itself made her wiser, steadier, more entitled to opinions about how the rest of us lived. My parents, particularly my mother, reinforced this constantly, in ways so small and so consistent that it took me decades to see the pattern clearly. That's the thing about patterns. They're invisible until you have enough data points to draw the line through them. Let me give you the data points. Example 1. When I lost my job 8 months ago, my mother's first phone call wasn't to ask how I was doing. It was 6:50 p.m. on a Thursday evening. I remember because I was still sitting at my kitchen table with a termination letter open on my laptop screen, the HR department's language dressed up in words like restructuring and redundancy pool. She called not to check on me, but to ask whether I'd told Claire yet, because you know how she worries about the family's reputation. Not my well-being. Not how I'd pay my mortgage, which at that point was £780 a month with 11 months of savings behind it if I was careful. The family's reputation, as if my unemployment were a stain on the family crest rather than something happening to an actual person. Her actual daughter, sitting alone at a kitchen table with a laptop and a cold cup of tea. Example 2, at Christmas, 4 months after I'd been laid off, my mother sat me down at the dinner table, in front of my Aunt Denise, my cousin Priya and Ryan, and suggested gently but publicly that maybe I should consider something more realistic, like retail work at the Trafford Centre, just to have something, Margaret, just to keep busy. I remember the exact dish on the table when she said it. A Christmas pudding, half-cut, brandy butter melting into the plate, because I stared at that plate the entire time she spoke, counting the seconds until someone changed the subject. Claire nodded along the entire time, sipping her wine, saying nothing but clearly enjoying every second of it. Her eyes doing that thing where they flick toward you just to make sure you've noticed she's watching. Example 3, and this is the one that still sits in my chest like a stone. 2 months ago, Claire asked to borrow £4,000 from our mother for a kitchen renovation. Quartz countertops, she specified, nothing cheap-looking, and a new induction hob because the old gas one wasn't safe around the grandchildren. She got the money within a week. No questions asked. No conditions attached. No spreadsheet, no repayment schedule, nothing. When I mentioned, carefully without asking for anything, just as a passing comment over tea one Sunday, that I was covering a gap in freelance income that month, roughly £600 between two invoices that hadn't cleared yet, my mother told me she didn't want to enable bad habits. I hadn't asked her for a single pound. I'd mentioned a fact about my life and she heard a request because in her mind, that's all I was capable of anymore. A request, a burden, a drain on a family that had already decided, quietly and long ago, who deserved help and who deserved lectures. There's a fourth example I don't often tell people, because it's smaller, and smallness is sometimes what cuts deepest. 3 years ago, before any of this, before the layoff, before the freelancing, before any of it, I helped Claire and Gary refinance their mortgage. I spent an entire weekend combing through paperwork, comparing lender rates, flagging an early repayment penalty buried on page 14 of a document neither of them had read, because Gary, for all his dealerships, has never once read a contract he signed in his life. I saved them £340 a month for the life of the loan. Over £40,000 across the full mortgage term if you do the maths, which I did because that's simply how my brain works. Claire thanked me with a bottle of Prosecco and never mentioned it again. When my situation reversed 8 months ago, that weekend simply didn't exist anymore in her memory. Debts like that only run in one direction in families like mine. You do the favor and the favor evaporates. You need the favor, and suddenly everyone remembers exactly what you owe. What they didn't know, none of them, not my mother, not Claire, not even Ryan fully, was that I'd stopped needing any of them financially 6 months earlier. What they didn't know was that 3 separate companies had my consulting rate card by then, at £75 an hour, nearly double what I'd started at when I first began freelancing from that kitchen table. And one of them, a startup called Vero, had quietly become the most important client relationship in my professional life, even though not one person in that company beyond my son and his CTO knew my actual name, let alone what I was capable of. I used to lie awake some nights wondering if I should just tell them. Sit my mother down, tell Claire directly, put an end to the assumptions once and for all. But there's a particular kind of peace that comes from being underestimated. An invisibility that lets you watch people show you exactly who they are, without the performance changing because they know you're capable of more. I chose silence for a long time because silence let me see things clearly. What I didn't yet understand was that silence has a cost too. It lets the humiliation build unchecked until it finds its way into a garden in Didsbury, on a warm June evening, in front of 40 people and a man I'd never met. That should have been the end of the story right there. A quiet redemption arc unfolding behind the scenes, unnoticed by the people who'd underestimated me, resolving itself eventually on its own terms. It wasn't. Because 2 weeks before that garden party, Ryan's CTO, Daniel Cho, had made an offer that I hadn't yet told anyone about. Not my family, not even Ryan fully understood the scope of it, and it was about to collide, violently and publicly, with my sister's need for an audience. I remember the exact sound of that glass, 3 seats down, setting itself against the marble table. I remember thinking, right before he stood up, watching him set that glass down with a precision that felt almost surgical. He knows something I haven't told anyone yet. You know that feeling, don't you? Sitting in a room where everyone thinks they know exactly who you are, and only one person in the whole place knows they're wrong. That's where I was standing. That's where this story actually begins. I want to take you back to that garden because I don't think I gave you the full picture the first time. I want you to see it the way I saw it. The string lights, the smell of grilled lamb drifting from Gary's outdoor kitchen that cost more than my first car, the low hum of 40 conversations happening at once, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a man 3 seats down from me who hadn't said more than a polite hello all evening. His name, though I didn't know it yet, was Daniel Cho. 38 years old, CTO of Vero, the man who had spent the last 11 months believing my son had single-handedly rebuilt an entire warehouse orchestration system in 3 sleepless nights. Ryan had invited him as a guest, the way you invite a boss you respect and slightly fear, hoping he'd see the family as normal, warm, unremarkable. Ryan had no idea what was about to happen. Neither did I. The party had been going for almost 2 hours by that point. My nephew Jamie, Claire's son, the actual reason we were all there, had given a short, sweet speech about his graduation, thanking his parents, thanking his grandparents, and everyone had clapped and champagne had been poured. And for a while it felt like an ordinary family gathering, the kind where nothing goes wrong because everyone's too busy eating to cause trouble. Then Gary made a toast to family and to success, and lifted his glass, and Claire, 3 glasses of Sauvignon Blanc into the evening by then, her voice already carrying that particular looseness that comes before people say things they'd never say sober, turned to me with a smile that I now recognize in retrospect as the smile of someone who had been waiting for an opening. "Speaking of success," she said, raising her own glass toward me, loud enough that 3 separate conversations near us simply stopped mid-sentence. "Let's toast to Maggie too. To finally finding a job. Oh wait." She laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh, and looked around at the guests, gathering an audience the way she always does before she says something she's been saving up. "Still no job, Maggie? Still living off your son's paycheck? God, when's the last time you actually earned something on your own?" I felt my face go hot. Not from shame, or not only from shame, but from the specific, familiar humiliation of being discussed rather than spoken to, like a case study passed around at a dinner table. I saw my mother's eyes flick toward me, not with concern, but with a kind of nervous anticipation, the way you watch a car you suspect is about to hit something. I saw Ryan, standing near the drinks table with a beer in his hand, go completely still. "A grown woman," Claire continued, warming to it now, enjoying the silence she'd created, "sitting there every day doing nothing, while her son works himself into the ground to pay her bills. I mean, honestly, jobless loser. That's what you are. Let's just say it out loud since nobody else will." There was laughter. Not from everyone. Most people looked uncomfortable, glancing at their plates, at their phones, anywhere but at me. But someone laughed, a cousin I won't name, a nervous, complicit little laugh that seemed to give Claire permission to keep going. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't dignity, not entirely. It was calculation. Years of these moments had taught me that anything I said in that instant would be twisted, replayed, used as evidence of exactly the bitterness and instability Claire had always accused me of. Silence was the only move on the board that didn't lose ground. So I sat there, my Prosecco glass sweating in my hand, and I let her finish. "I mean, look at you," she said, gesturing at my dress. The £11 charity shop dress I'd been quietly proud of an hour earlier. "You used to have a real career. Now you're just this." It's actually kind of sad if you think about it. That's when I heard it. The glass. 3 seats down. Daniel Cho set his champagne flute down on the marble side table. Slowly, deliberately. The sound cutting cleanly through Claire's laughter and the low murmur of 40 people pretending not to listen. He stood up. "I want you to understand." I had no idea what he was about to say. I assumed in that first half second that he was simply excusing himself, embarrassed on my behalf, looking for the nearest exit from a family drama that wasn't his. That's what strangers usually do. They leave. He didn't leave. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice had a calm, unhurried quality that somehow commanded more attention than Claire's had. "But I think there's something you should know." The garden went quiet in a different way now. Not the awkward shifting eyes quiet of second-hand embarrassment, but a sharper, more alert silence, the kind that happens when people sense that something real is about to occur. "My name's Daniel," he said, addressing the table generally, though his eyes were on Claire. "I'm Ryan's CTO at Vero." He paused, letting that land, watching Claire's expression shift slightly, recalibrating, the way people do when they realize a stranger might have more context than they assumed. 11 months ago, our entire warehouse management system failed. We were 3 days from losing a client contract worth £340,000 a year. Our operations were falling apart in real time, and I was the one who was supposed to fix it, and I couldn't. He turned toward Ryan now. Ryan came into my office and said he could rebuild the system. I didn't believe him, no Ryan, because frankly it wasn't his area and I'd never seen him do anything close to that level of architecture work before. But he did it. 3 nights, no sleep, and by the 4th morning, the entire orchestration layer was rebuilt. The client kept the contract, and I promoted him within 2 months. I remember feeling my stomach drop right there because I understood exactly where this was going, and there was no way to stop it, and some small, tired part of me didn't want to stop it anymore. What I didn't know, Daniel continued, until about 3 weeks ago, was that Ryan didn't do that alone. He told me, actually, he was pretty emotional about it if I'm honest, that his mother had spent 3 nights on the phone and on remote access with him, rebuilding that entire system herself in real time from her kitchen table because he was too proud and honestly too scared to tell his own CTO that he needed help. She didn't take a single pound for it. She didn't ask for credit. She did it because he's her son and he called her at midnight in a panic. He looked directly at me now. Margaret Ellison spent 26 years as a systems architect for companies far bigger than mine. She's not unemployed because she can't get hired. She's been turning down junior-level offers because she knows exactly what she's worth, and she's been quietly building a client base as an independent consultant instead, one of which, as it happens, is my company. He paused. 3 weeks ago, I found out who'd actually saved our biggest contract that year. And 2 weeks ago, I offered her a formal consulting retainer with Verro. She hasn't given me her answer yet, actually. I was rather hoping tonight might change her mind. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in that family in 54 years. Claire's face had gone the particular shade of pale that happens when the ground shifts under someone who was certain of their footing a second earlier. My mother's mouth was slightly open. Gary had stopped chewing entirely, his fork frozen halfway to his plate. Jobless loser, Daniel said quietly now, almost gently, isn't really the phrase I'd use for someone who saved my company's biggest client without asking for a single thing in return. Nobody clapped. I want to be clear about that, because in the version of this story people usually imagine, there's applause, a triumphant swell, a room rising to its feet. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and in its own way, far more devastating. 40 people slowly, silently returning their attention to their plates, their glasses, their phones, while Claire sat frozen with a glass of wine going warm in her hand and no laugh left in her at all. I didn't say anything either. Not yet. There would be time for that. What I remember most clearly, sitting there in that stunned quiet, was a single unanswered question forming in my mind, one that had nothing to do with Claire at all. What exactly had Daniel Cho offered me, and why hadn't Ryan told me he'd already discussed it with his boss? That question would take me 2 more weeks, 3 phone calls, and 1 very careful reading of a contract to fully answer. And the answer, when it came, was bigger than anything I'd expected walking into that garden that evening. For 2 weeks after that garden party, nobody in my family mentioned what had happened. Not directly, anyway. There's a particular kind of silence families deploy when something has shifted and nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it out loud. A silence that isn't peace, just a held breath, the kind that sits in a room the way smoke sits after a fire's been put out but nobody's opened the windows yet. My mother called once on the Tuesday after the party and spent 11 minutes talking about Freya's exam results. AB in chemistry, a disappointment she discussed with the gravity most people reserve for medical diagnoses, before finally, almost casually, almost as an afterthought, asking, "So, is it true what that man said about Verro?" Told her yes. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her television playing faintly in the background. Some quiz show, a studio audience clapping at an answer neither of us could hear clearly. She said, "Well," and then nothing else, as if the word itself was a complete sentence, and changed the subject back to Freya's chemistry grade, as though my entire professional life could be filed under noted and set aside. Claire didn't call at all. Not that week, not the next. I noticed the silence more than I expected to. 20-some years of being talked over, talked about, and talked down to had left me strangely unprepared for what her actual silence felt like. Less like relief, more like waiting for a second shoe that hadn't dropped yet. You know that feeling, don't you, when the absence of conflict feels somehow more unsettling than the conflict itself, because you've learned, through long experience, that quiet in certain families isn't peace. It's just reloading. I want to explain what Daniel Cho had actually offered me because it was bigger and far more precise than anything he'd said out loud in that garden, and understanding the exact shape of it matters enormously for everything that came after 3 days after the party. Daniel emailed me directly, formally, from his Vero company address. No small talk, no reference to the party at all, just a clean, professional subject line. Consulting retainer, discussion. He asked if we could meet at their offices in Spinningfields the following week. I said Thursday morning worked. I spent the 2 days beforehand doing something I hadn't done in 8 months. I bought a blazer. Navy, tailored, £89 from a shop on Deansgate, purchased specifically for job interviews that had never once gotten far enough to actually require one. I remember standing in the changing room, looking at myself in that blazer, thinking, this is either the most ridiculous thing I've done all year, or it's the first time in 8 months I've dressed for the life I actually want instead of the one I've been apologizing for. The Vero office was on the 9th floor of a glass building near the Spinningfields tram stop. Open plan, exposed brick on one wall for character, the kind of space that smells faintly of new carpet and ambition, 40 desks arranged in loose clusters, a small kitchen with an espresso machine nobody seemed fully confident operating, judging by the handwritten note taped above it that simply read, "Ask Priya. She's the only one who understands this thing." Daniel walked me through it himself, past a wall of framed photographs marking company milestones. The seed round, the office move, the series a close 18 months earlier, none of which I'd been part of, despite having quietly saved one of their biggest client contracts from total collapse 11 months prior, from a kitchen table 40 minutes away, entirely unpaid, entirely unnamed, entirely invisible to every single person in those photographs. He sat me down in a meeting room labeled, with the kind of earnestness startups can't help themselves, the depot. A nod, I assumed, to the warehouse depots the whole system had nearly failed to serve, and slid a document across the table. 12 pages, stapled. A Vero logo on the header of every single one. It wasn't a job offer. It was a consulting retainer agreement. 12 months, renewable, for £1,200 a month, plus equity in the form of stock options vesting over 3 years, contingent on a minimum of 2 full systems audits per quarter and on-call architecture support during peak fulfillment windows. "I looked into your background properly after the party," he said, watching me read. His fingers laced together on the table in front of him. "Your old fintech role. The leads logistics work before that. The client list on your freelance site, which, by the way, is criminally underselling your rate. I'd have paid double what you were charging some of those companies." He tapped the document with 2 fingers, a habit I'd notice he did whenever he wanted to underline a point without raising his voice. I should have looked sooner. Frankly, I should have looked the moment Ryan told me the truth about that database migration, instead of just being grateful and moving straight on with my quarter like nothing had happened. Pause longer this time. "This isn't charity, Margaret. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how these conversations can sound. And I don't want you walking out of here thinking I'm handing you a favor out of guilt. This is a company that nearly lost £340,000 a year in annual contract value because our systems weren't built to survive contact with reality. I don't want that to happen again, ever, under any circumstances. I want the person who actually understands why it happened permanently on retainer. Not as a favor to my employee's mother, but because you are, bluntly, better at this than anyone currently on my payroll." I read every clause twice before I said a single word back to him. There was a non-compete clause limited, reasonably, to direct competitors within Greater Manchester. There was an IP assignment clause covering any architecture I built specifically for Vero, standard practice, and entirely fair, given I'd be paid properly for the work this time, unlike the 3 nights that had started all of this. And then there was one clause I genuinely hadn't anticipated, tucked into Section 9, in a font size slightly smaller than the rest. A right of first refusal on a Series B advisory seat, should Vero raise a second funding round within the next 18 months, something their investors, Daniel mentioned almost in passing, waving a hand as though it were a minor footnote rather than the single most valuable line in the entire document, were already signaling they intended to pursue by early next year. I didn't sign it that day. I told Daniel I needed a week to review it properly, which was true, though not entirely for the reason he assumed. I didn't need time to decide whether I wanted the work itself. I'd wanted work exactly like this for the better part of 8 months. Work that used every year of experience I'd spent building instead of asking me to shrink myself into something smaller and more forgivable. What I needed time to think through was what it would mean to walk back into my family with a signed contract in hand, and whether some quiet, tired part of me was already imagining, in more detail than I wanted to admit, exactly how I intended to use it. Here's what I did with that week, in order because the order matters, and because I think it's the part of this story that separates a reaction from a strategy. First, I called an old colleague from my fintech days, a woman named Preeti who'd since retrained and now worked as a contract solicitor in a small firm off King Street, the kind of firm with a brass nameplate and a receptionist who remembers your name after one visit. I asked her to review the retainer line by line, not because I distrusted Daniel personally, but because 26 years in this industry teaches you that trust and due diligence are not the same instrument, and the people who confuse the two are usually the ones who discover, 3 years later, exactly what was buried on page 14 while they were too relieved to be offered anything at all to read carefully. Preeti found nothing alarming in the core terms. She did flag that the equity vesting schedule was unusually generous for a consulting arrangement rather than a full-time hire. "They clearly want you locked in," she said dryly over the phone, papers rustling on her end. "In the nicest possible way, but locked in all the same." She suggested I push the monthly retainer up slightly, given the on-call clause, which effectively meant I was agreeing to be reachable during peak periods regardless of the hour. Exactly as I had been 11 months earlier at midnight for free with nobody's name on the invoice at all. I made the ask over email that same afternoon. Daniel agreed to £4,600 without a single round of pushback, replying within 40 minutes, which told me, more clearly than anything printed in the contract itself, exactly how much guilt that garden party had cost him, and exactly how much my 3 sleepless nights the previous year had actually been worth to a company that, at the time, hadn't even known my name. The second thing I did with that week was quieter and more deliberate, and it's the part of this story I return to most often now, turning it over the way you turn over stone just to see what's underneath, curious rather than anxious. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Claire. I told Ryan, and only Ryan, sworn to secrecy over a cup of tea at my kitchen table. The same table, incidentally, where I'd rebuilt his company's entire warehouse system 11 months earlier, because I wanted to see what would happen if the truth simply sat there, unspoken, gathering weight the way water gathers behind a dam nobody's inspected in years, pressure building quietly against a wall that had held. Only because nobody had thought to test it. What they didn't know, what I hadn't fully disclosed even to Daniel during that meeting in the depot, was that I'd already begun quietly consulting for a second company by then. A smaller logistics firm based in Leeds, paying £3,800 a month for roughly 10 hours a week of architecture review, a contract I'd signed 4 months earlier and told absolutely nobody about, not even Ryan. Because by that point secrecy had simply become a habit, a small private room I could retreat into where nobody's opinion of me carried any weight at all. Between the 2 contracts, once the Verro retainer was formally signed, I would be earning more monthly before equity than I had in my final salaried role before the layoff. Not between things, the phrase I'd handed my family like a placeholder for 8 months, offered up so often it had started to feel like a second name. Not a jobless anything. A woman who had spent those same 8 months building, quietly and without a single audience, exactly the kind of career security that Claire had spent mocking her for lacking, in front of 40 people, over a glass of Sauvignon Blanc that was still, if I'm honest, sitting untouched in my memory like evidence. I signed the Verro contract on a Wednesday morning, in the depot meeting room, with Preeti's revisions incorporated and Daniel's signature already dried on the last page. He shook my hand and said, "Welcome aboard properly this time," and I remember thinking that the word properly did a great deal of quiet work in that single sentence, an acknowledgement, without quite saying it outright, that I should have been welcomed aboard 11 months earlier, the night I rebuilt his company's entire warehouse orchestration system from a laptop at my kitchen table, 3 cups of tea gone cold beside me, while his own operations team slept soundly at home, entirely unaware how close they'd come to losing their biggest client of the year. That should have felt like the end of something. A resolution. A quiet, private victory I could simply enjoy on my own terms, the way I'd told myself for 8 months I wanted to, savoring it alone the way you're supposed to savor the things that matter most. It wasn't the end of anything. Because that same Wednesday evening my phone rang again. My mother, not calling about Freya's exam results this time, but about something else entirely. Something in her voice that was tighter, more urgent, that made it immediately clear the garden party hadn't been the last time Claire intended to make a scene about my life. Whatever I decided to do next, I understood in that moment, listening to my mother's voice shift into that particular register of family alarm, would have to account for the fact that my family, given any choice at all, would always default to the version of me that made them most comfortable. Regardless of what I had actually built, quietly, methodically, patiently, while none of them were watching closely enough to notice. I hadn't told anyone outside Ryan about the signed contract yet. But somebody, somehow, already suspected something was different. And that suspicion was about to force my hand 2 full weeks earlier than I had planned. My mother's call that Wednesday evening lasted 4 minutes. But I remember every second of it, because it changed the timeline of everything I'd planned to do next. "Claire's furious," she said, without any greeting, without asking how my day had gone, without even the customary opening about the weather that usually softens the first 10 seconds of any call between us. "She's been asking around." Somebody at the party mentioned Verreau to Denise, and Denise mentioned it to Claire. And now Claire wants to know exactly what's going on. And I think you need to just tell her, Margaret, before this turns into something bigger than it needs to be. I want you to notice something in that sentence because I noticed it immediately. Sitting there at my kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear and the evening light doing that particular amber thing it does in June, slanting low across the countertop. My mother wasn't calling to check on me. She wasn't calling to say she was proud or curious, or even mildly interested in what I'd actually achieved over the past 11 months. She was calling because Claire was uncomfortable, and my mother's instinct, as always, as it had been for 54 years, was to manage Claire's comfort before anything else, including the truth, including me. 26 years of a career, 11 months of unpaid, sleepless labor to save her grandson's employer's biggest contract, a signed retainer with real numbers behind it. And the entire weight of my mother's concern still landed, reflexively, predictably, on her younger daughter's feelings, the way water always finds the same low point in a garden no matter how many times you think you've leveled it. "I'll tell her when I'm ready," I said. "Margaret, I'll tell her when I'm ready, Mum." I hung up gently, not dramatically. I didn't slam the phone down or raise my voice, because I'd promised myself, somewhere around day 3 of planning all of this, that I wasn't going to give anyone in this family the satisfaction of calling me hysterical, not even privately, not even to myself. I simply ended the call the way you'd end a meeting that had run past its useful purpose, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, turning my empty mug in slow circles, listening to the fridge hum, thinking through what I actually wanted to happen next. Here is the thing about revenge that nobody tells you when you're the one who spent 8 months being humiliated at family dinners. The version you imagine in the heat of the moment is loud. It involves standing up, saying the sharp thing you've rehearsed in the shower at 11 at night, watching someone's face fall in real time, an audience gasping the way they never gasped for you, a room finally seeing you the way you know yourself to be. But I'd had 8 months to imagine that scene, replaying it in various forms, various dinners, various rooms. Sometimes it was the whole family watching, sometimes just Claire. Sometimes I imagined saying nothing at all and simply walking out, coat over my arm, dignity intact. And by the time I actually had the leverage to make any version of it real, I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't want loud anymore. I wanted precise. I wanted something that couldn't be argued away over the next family dinner, softened into a joke, or quietly erased from memory the way my £340 a month mortgage favor to Claire had been erased 3 years earlier, as if it had simply never occurred, as if I'd imagined an entire weekend of unpaid labor on her behalf. So instead of calling Claire, I made a list. An actual list, written by hand in the notebook I use for client work, because I've learned over 26 years that clarity of thought requires the discipline of writing things down rather than just circling them endlessly in your head at 2 in the morning, which is where most of my worst decisions have historically been made. The first thing on that list was documentation. I know that sounds unglamorous. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just paperwork, spreadsheets, and email thread. But documentation was the only thing in this entire saga that had ever actually worked in my favor, and the one thing that had been conspicuously missing from the 11 months I'd spent rescuing Verreau for free, invisible, unnamed, unprotected. I asked Daniel over email whether Vero would be comfortable with me listing the retainer publicly on LinkedIn, and whether he'd be willing to write a short recommendation referencing the warehouse incident specifically, by name, with the client contract value included, in writing, permanently attached to my professional record. He agreed immediately. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to be asked, as though he'd been looking for a way to make the acknowledgement more permanent than a toast at a garden party that only 40 people had witnessed and even fewer would remember accurately in a year's time, the details already softening at the edges the way memory does with anything inconvenient. Within 3 days, my LinkedIn profile had a testimonial from the CTO of a venture-backed logistics company, describing, in professional and entirely verifiable language, exactly what I'd done 11 months earlier and exactly what I'd been hired to do going forward. I read that testimonial more times than I'd like to admit, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, refreshing the page like a teenager checking for likes. Not out of vanity, or not only out of vanity, out of something closer to relief. The relief of finally having a written record that couldn't be reinterpreted at the next Christmas dinner, couldn't be waved away with a laugh and a change of subject the way Claire had waved away 3 years of a mortgage favor with a single bottle of Prosecco. The second thing on that list was Preeti. I called her again, not this time for contract review, but for something more specific, more hypothetical, though we both understood it wasn't really hypothetical at all. I asked her what my legal standing would have been if Vero's warehouse system had failed catastrophically and I'd been the unpaid, unofficial architect who fixed it, with no written agreement in place at the time. No NDA, no scope document, nothing. She laughed, not unkindly. The particular laugh of someone who has seen this exact scenario play out professionally more times than she can count, and told me I'd had essentially no protection whatsoever. No IP claim. No liability shield. Nothing at all standing between me and total exposure if a single line of that emergency rebuild had gone wrong. You did 11 months, well really 3 nights of actual hands-on labor, with 11 months of quiet exposure hanging over it, of work for free informally with real financial consequences riding on it, and you had 0 paper trail, she said, and I could hear her tapping something on her end, a pen against a desk, the sound of someone thinking while they talk. If that had gone wrong instead of right, you'd have had nothing to stand on, and neither would Ryan. You'd have been the unnamed woman who happened to be on the phone when it all fell apart. And depending on how bitter that company's investors felt afterward, you could genuinely have been looking at some exposure there, informally or not. I already knew this, on some level, in the vague, uneasy way you know things you've chosen not to examine too closely. But hearing it stated plainly by a solicitor, in that flat professional register, did something to solidify my resolve in a way that vague unease never quite manages to. Silence and quiet generosity had cost me leverage for 11 months. I wasn't going to make that mistake again in any direction with any company or, and this was the part that mattered most, sitting there afterward with the phone still warm in my hand, with any member of my own family. The third thing on that list was Ryan. I sat him down, properly at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd rebuilt an entire warehouse orchestration system on no sleep 11 months earlier, the same table where I'd signed nothing, been paid nothing and asked for nothing, and told him everything. The Vero retainer, the leads contract, the equity clause, all of it, start to finish, no editing for his comfort, no softening the parts where I admitted I'd been keeping secrets from the whole family for months. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea, turning the mug slightly the way I do, a habit he must have picked up from me without either of us noticing, some small inherited gesture neither of us would have been able to name if you'd asked us directly. Then he said something that surprised me, something I've turned over in my head many times since. Mum, I think I've been protecting them from the truth about you for years without even realizing it. Every time someone made a comment at dinner, I just went quiet, because I didn't want it to turn into a bigger argument. I think I made it easier for Claire to keep doing it, because I never once told her she was wrong, and silence from me probably looked like agreement, even though it never was. I told him that wasn't his fault. He said he knew that, logically, intellectually, but it didn't make the guilt go away, and I understood that completely, because I'd spent 8 months feeling exactly the same thing about my own silence. The particular specific guilt of watching an injustice happen slowly, in real time, in front of you, and telling yourself that staying quiet was strategy rather than simply fear dressed up in strategy's clothing, which is a distinction that's much easier to make from a distance than it ever is in the actual room. Here's the part where I have to be honest about my own motives, because I think a story like this loses its value if the narrator pretends to be purer than she actually was, tidier than the truth allows. I did want Claire to feel what I'd felt in that garden. I'm not going to dress that up as something nobler than it was, wrap it in language about boundaries and closure when underneath it was, plainly, a desire for her to hurt the way I'd hurt. There's a version of me, and I met her briefly, somewhere around day 9 of that 10-day planning window, lying awake at 2:30. That would have been perfectly happy watching Claire stew in that discomfort for months, saying nothing further, simply letting the silence do its slow, corrosive work the way her comment had done its damage in front of 40 people who would remember for years the shape of that humiliation, even if they forgot the exact words. But I also understood, watching Ryan across that kitchen table, turning his mug the way I do, that if I handled this the way Claire had handled everything, loudly, publicly, designed to humiliate rather than inform, I'd be teaching him by direct example that this was how families settled scores. That the correct response to being hurt was to find the largest possible audience and inflict something equal in return. An eye for an eye conducted over Prosecco and grilled lamb. I didn't want that legacy. Not for him, and honestly, not for the version of myself I wanted to become on the other side of this. The version I could still respect in the mirror in 6 months, a year, a decade, long after Claire's specific insult had faded into just another family story told at gatherings I might not even attend. So the plan I built over the following 10 days was designed around a single principle, one I wrote at the top of that same notebook page, underlined twice. Everything true delivered privately first with the option, but never the obligation, to make it public if Claire forced my hand again. I asked my mother to arrange a lunch. Just the 3 of us, my mother, Claire and me. At a quiet cafe near the Trafford Centre, the same shopping centre my mother had once suggested. At that Christmas dinner 4 months into my unemployment, I find retail work in. Just to have something, Margaret, just to keep busy. I chose the location deliberately. I'm not entirely proud of the small cruelty embedded in that choice, but I'll admit to it here, because I think honesty matters more in this story than looking gracious throughout. I wanted Claire sitting somewhere that reminded her, even subconsciously, of the smallness she tried to assign me, without ever having to say a single word about it directly, letting the location itself do a small, silent piece of the work. The lunch happened on a Sunday, 11 days after Daniel's toast in that garden. Claire arrived 12 minutes late, sunglasses still on indoors, a habit of hers that always signaled she wanted to control exactly how much of her expression the room could see before she decided how she wanted to play things. She ordered a flat white and an all-day breakfast, refused to make eye contact with me for the first several minutes, examining the laminated menu with an intensity that seemed designed purely to avoid looking up, and finally, when my mother ran out of small talk to fill the silence with, she'd exhausted Freya's chemistry grade, the weather, a mutual friend's kitchen extension. Claire set the menu down and said, "So, Vero, are you going to explain that? Or are we all just supposed to pretend it didn't happen?" I'd rehearsed almost nothing for this moment on purpose, because I didn't want it to sound rehearsed. And Claire has always been unusually good at spotting a prepared speech and using its polish as evidence that whatever I was saying wasn't quite genuine, that I'd cooked something up in advance rather than simply telling the truth. I told her plainly, calmly, about the 11 months of unpaid work, about Daniel's discovery 3 weeks earlier, about the retainer, about the Leeds contract she didn't yet know existed, about the combined monthly income that now exceeded my final salaried role before the layoff by roughly £1,400 a month, before equity was even factored in. I told her all of it in the flat, factual tone I'd have used presenting to a skeptical client, because I wanted the facts to do the work rather than my delivery. And because I've learned, over 26 years of technical presentations to executives who didn't want to hear bad news, that emotion invites argument, but numbers, stated plainly, without embellishment, tend not to. Claire's face went through several expressions in the span of about 90 seconds. Disbelief first, genuine and unguarded, then something that looked almost like calculation, the wheels visibly turning behind her eyes as she tried to work out how this new information reflected on her, rather than on me, whether there was some angle she could still play, and finally something closer to genuine discomfort, an expression I'd rarely seen on her in 52 years of being her older sister, an expression that made her look, for just a moment, younger than she was, the way people sometimes do when they're caught somewhere they didn't expect to be caught. "Why didn't you just tell us?" she said, and there was an accusatory edge to it, sharp, immediate, as though my silence had been the actual offense here, rather than 8 months of her mockery, as though the burden of disclosure had somehow always rested on me and never on the people doing the mocking. "Because," I said, and this is the line I'd actually planned, the only one, the single sentence I'd allowed myself to prepare in advance because I knew, if I didn't have this much ready, I might lose my nerve and let her off easier than she deserved. "Every time I've told this family the truth about my life, it's been used against me at the next opportunity. I stopped trusting you with information a long time ago, Claire. That's not new. What's new is that I finally have enough leverage that it doesn't matter anymore whether you believe me or not." She didn't have a response to that. Not one. My mother, to her credit, went very quiet, staring into her coffee, turning her spoon slowly around the rim of the cup, and I understood, watching her, that some small, overdue recalibration was happening in her head too. A recognition, however incomplete and however temporary it might turn out to be, that the family's internal ledger of who deserved concern and who deserved lectures had been kept extremely badly for a very long time, possibly for decades, and that she herself had been the one holding the pen the entire time, entry after entry, always in the same direction. I want to be clear that this lunch wasn't the climax of the story. It wasn't the moment where Claire broke down and apologized and everything was resolved with tears and a group hug across a cafe table sticky with spilled syrup. That's not how families like mine work, and frankly, I'd have been suspicious of that outcome if it had happened, the way you're suspicious of a system that suddenly stops throwing errors without you having actually fixed anything underneath. What that lunch actually did was something quieter and, I think, considerably more durable. It removed Claire's ability to act like she didn't know. Whatever she chose to do next, she would be doing it now with full information in front of witnesses, which meant any future comment about my employment status would be, unambiguously, a choice rather than an assumption. And choices, unlike assumptions, can be held against a person in a way that sticks. The unresolved question I carried out of that cafe that Sunday afternoon wasn't whether Claire understood the facts now. She clearly did. I'd watched the understanding land on her face in real time. The real question was whether she'd actually change her behavior going forward, or whether, as she'd done with the mortgage favor 3 years earlier, as she'd done with every uncomfortable truth in our family's history, she'd simply let the discomfort fade until she felt safe enough to test the boundary again, the way certain systems only fail once you've stopped monitoring them closely, once everyone's attention has drifted somewhere else. I didn't have an answer to that yet, walking out into the car park with my mother trailing a few steps behind, saying nothing. I'd find out 4 weeks later, at a family barbecue I almost didn't attend, in a moment that would settle the question far more permanently, and far more publicly, than any quiet lunch conversation ever could. 4 weeks after that lunch near the Trafford Centre, my father turned 68, and as he does every year, he asked for nothing more than a barbecue in the back garden, burgers, a few bottles of beer, the grandchildren running around the lawn until it got dark. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. Part of me had quietly decided that the lunch with Claire had said everything that needed saying, and that showing up to another family gathering, so soon after, risked reopening a wound that had only just begun to close over. Ryan talked me into it. "If you don't go," he said, "it looks like you're hiding. And you're not the one who should be hiding anymore." He was right, though I didn't fully appreciate how right until I was standing in my parents' garden that Saturday afternoon, paper plate in hand, watching Claire from across the lawn. She'd been polite to me since the cafe. Not warm but civil, the kind of careful, measured politeness people perform when they're recalibrating how much space you're allowed to take up in a room. I'd told myself that was progress, or at least the beginning of it. It lasted exactly until her second glass of wine. Gary was manning the barbecue, flipping burgers with the studied confidence of a man who owns 3 car dealerships and treats every activity, including cooking meat, as an opportunity to demonstrate competence. My father was telling the same story about his retirement pension he tells every year. And Claire, standing near the drinks table with Denise, thought she was speaking quietly enough that I wouldn't hear. "I still think it's a bit much," she said, swirling her wine. "All this fuss over a consulting contract. I mean, good for her, but it's not like she's running the company. It's a bit rich, everyone acting like she's some kind of genius now." Denise, to her credit, looked uncomfortable and said something I didn't catch. But Claire wasn't finished. And honestly, she continued, lowering her voice further but not quite far enough, I still think if she'd just gotten a proper job 8 months ago instead of messing about freelancing, none of this would even be a story. She got lucky. That's all this is. Luck. I felt something in my chest tighten. Not the hot, humiliated flush from the garden party 4 weeks earlier, but something colder, steadier. Because here was the answer to the question I'd carried out of that cafe. Claire hadn't changed. She'd simply learned to lower her volume. The information hadn't moved her an inch. It had only taught her to be quieter about her contempt. I want to tell you that I walked over calmly and delivered some perfectly composed line that ended the conversation for good. That's not quite what happened, and I think the truth is more useful than the fantasy. What actually happened is that Ryan heard her too. He was closer than I was, refilling his own drink at the same table, and he set his glass down. Not with Daniel's theatrical precision, just a simple, decisive motion, and said loud enough that half the garden turned. Aunt Claire, can I ask you something? Do you know how much Vero's series B round is worth? Claire blinked. What? Because Mum's advisory seat vests the moment we close it, which is next month. And the number being floated to investors is £11 million. He paused. So when you say she got lucky, I just want to make sure you understand what you're actually describing. Because from where I'm standing, luck had absolutely nothing to do with 3 sleepless nights of unpaid architecture work that saved my job and this whole company, followed by 8 months of you calling her a jobless loser for it. I hadn't told Ryan the exact Series B figure. I found out later he'd asked Daniel directly, the week before, specifically because he suspected this exact moment might come, and he wanted to be armed with something undeniable when it did. That's the part that still gets me thinking back on it. My son quietly building his own case file in advance, the same way I had. The garden went silent in that particular way gardens do when something true has just been said in a space built for pleasantries. My father stopped mid-sentence about his pension. Gary looked up from the barbecue, spatula frozen in one hand. My mother's face did something complicated. Pride and embarrassment fighting for the same expression, unable to settle on either. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. For the second time in 4 weeks, she had nothing. I think, my mother said finally, quietly into the silence, in a voice I hadn't heard her use before. Not the voice she used to manage Claire's feelings, but something plainer, more tired. She'd simply learned to lower her volume. The information hadn't moved her an inch. It had only taught her to be quieter about her contempt. I want to tell you that I walked over calmly and delivered some perfectly composed line that ended the conversation for good. That's not quite what happened, and I think the truth is more useful than the fantasy. What actually happened is that Ryan heard her too. He was closer than I was, refilling his own drink at the same table, and he set his glass down. Not with Daniel's theatrical precision, just a simple, decisive motion, and said loud enough that half the garden turned. Aunt Claire, can I ask you something? Do you know how much Vero's Series B round is worth? Claire blinked. What? Because Mum's advisory seat vests the moment we close it, which is next month. And the number being floated to investors is £11 million. He paused. So when you say she got lucky, I just want to make sure you understand what you're actually describing. Because from where I'm standing, luck had absolutely nothing to do with 3 sleepless nights of unpaid architecture work that saved my job and this whole company, followed by 8 months of you calling her a jobless loser for it. I hadn't told Ryan the exact Series B figure. I found out later he'd asked Daniel directly, the week before, specifically because he suspected this exact moment might come, and he wanted to be armed with something undeniable when it did. That's the part that still gets me thinking back on it. My son quietly building his own case file in advance, the same way I had. The garden went silent in that particular way gardens do when something true has just been said in a space built for pleasantries. My father stopped mid-sentence about his pension. Gary looked up from the barbecue, spatula frozen in one hand. My mother's face did something complicated. Pride and embarrassment fighting for the same expression, unable to settle on either. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. For the second time in 4 weeks, she had nothing. I think, my mother said finally, quietly into the silence, in a voice I hadn't heard her use before. Not the voice she used to manage Claire's feelings, but something plainer, more tired, more honest. I think we owe your sister an apology, Claire. Real one. Not today necessarily. But at some point. Because I've been thinking about that cafe for a month. And I don't like what I've realized about how this family actually works. Claire didn't apologize that day. I want to be honest about that too, because tidy endings make for better stories but worse truth. She left the barbecue early, claiming a headache, and didn't speak to me again for almost 6 weeks. But something had shifted permanently in the room that day, in a way the lunch alone hadn't managed. My father, 3 days later, called me. The first time he'd ever called specifically to talk about my work rather than ask when dinner was, and asked me genuinely, curiously, what an advisory seat actually involved. My mother started referring to my consulting work, unprompted, in conversations with her friends, in a tone I'd never once heard her use about anything I'd done professionally before. The series be closed 7 weeks later, in September, at £11.4 million. My advisory seat vested exactly as Ryan had said it would. Daniel asked me to formalize a second separate engagement. Architecture oversight across 2 new regional hubs. Verro was opening with the funding, at a rate that, combined with the Leeds contract, put my annual income within striking distance of what I'd earned in my final salaried role at the height of my career, before any of this began, before the layoff, before the garden, before any of it. Claire and I did eventually talk again, properly, at my father's request, over coffee. Not the cafe near the Trafford Centre this time, somewhere neutral, her choice. She didn't grovel. That's not who she is, and I'd stopped needing her to by then. But she said, stiffly, looking somewhere just past my shoulder rather than at my face. I was out of order. The party. I've thought about it a lot. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the tearful, cinematic reckoning some version of me, months earlier, might have wanted. But it was true, and it was hers to say, freely, without Ryan's numbers forcing her into it. And that mattered to me more than I expected it. Think about that champagne glass sometimes, the sound of it against the marble table. And I've come to understand it differently than I did the night it happened. At the time, I thought that sound was the beginning of my vindication. Looking back now, I think it was actually the end of something else. The end of a version of me that needed anyone else's toast, anyone else's public correction, to know what I was worth. I still work with Verro. I still take the occasional call at midnight, though now it comes with a rate card attached. And nobody assumes the labor is free simply because we share a surname. I still see my family. Christmas, birthdays, the occasional Sunday lunch. And it's not perfect, and I don't think it ever will be. Because families rarely get rebuilt from the studs up just because one truth finally landed correctly. But something essential changed the day Ryan set that glass down in our parents' garden. The story my family told about me, jobless, dependent, a cautionary tale to warn the grandchildren about, simply stopped being available to tell because it was no longer true, and because, for the first time in years, I'd made absolutely sure everyone in that garden had the receipts to prove it. If you've ever sat quietly through your own humiliation, calculating rather than reacting, waiting for the moment when the facts alone would be enough to do what your voice never could, I hope you remember that the waiting isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only strategy that actually holds up once the dust settles. And the loudest room in the world can't argue with a signed contract.